One. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lauren Hollows, and we are kicking off our YouTube 2024 Roundtable series on the RTO standards that are going to be coming into effect from 1/1/25. I am very fortunate to have two other professionals here with me today. I have Coleen Rivas from Raspberry Consulting, and I have Maree Thorne from Compliance Assist. I've been fortunate enough to interview both of these lovely ladies before. Both of those interviews will be linked below. But thank you very much, guys, for joining me today. Maree, would you like to just quickly introduce yourself?
Okay, so my name is Maree, obviously. I've been working in vet, I guess, for more than 20 years. So I probably give away my age a little. And basically sort of focused in areas of compliance, but more so in quality systems, so getting the processes right at the front ends rather than, as we've discussed before, Lauren, fixing the bits at the back ends. I myself was a primary school teacher. I moved into adult education. I sort of somewhere in the background have a hospitality background, or that's well out of date at the moment. But sort of working as a trainer, as an assessor, and then moving into sort of the more general administrative management areas. And I guess that's what I bring, to clients that I work with now.
Absolutely. And Coleen, how about you?
Okay. Hi, I've been in the vet sector for, like Maree, over 20 years. Started off, actually came out of the employment services sector, and I started working in TAFE as a teacher, but then I owned my own RTO for quite a few years. I've managed other RTOs over that time as well. In the last few years, I've moved more into consulting, although I'm quite passionate about, I love building assessment tools, but also love building training assessment strategies. And I know when I've run RTOs, Maree, I don't know if I've led them from the TAS. I've led them from, those design of the program, everything, the resources,
That's what
budgets.
I'm talking about.
Yeah. All of those things from the TAS. So I actually do love writing TASs. I don't get to write them very much anymore. I think they're a much bigger job than many people think. So yeah, so that's my background. I now do mostly a lot of writing resources, that sort of thing, professional development for trainers and assessors. Even while I was managing RTOs, I maintained my role as an assessor. So I would take on all those tricky RPLs or the gaps that needed to be filled, or those complicated ones that needed I was always that person. So I guess I was really a trainer who became an RTO manager, who's now probably working as a consultant. So yeah, that's my journey.
Excellent. So we are going to be talking today about the new RTO standards that are coming into effect from 1/1/25. We did have a little bit of a chat before we came online, but I'd be interested to get your guys' thoughts on, sort of what are the big things that you think are going to come out of the new standards? Where do you see it going? Kind of what were your initial thoughts when the new draft standards came out in their kind of most recent version?
Overall, I don't mind them. That might not be that might be unpopular. I hope they put validity back in as a rule of evidence, but mostly I'm okay. I think we're going to talk about 1.1 today. I think this is an area that has been missing for a long time. It's all been the focus on the TAS as some document. And that the document needs to have calculated numbers in it for the amount of training, and everyone's just trying to add those things up. And I think it missed the point of the quality, the quality of the training we deliver. And maybe unpopular, but I quite like it. I think overall, it's not perfect, but overall I prefer them. So I mean, you know, Maree, you're dealing with more on the compliance side of things. You may feel differently.
And not totally differently, Coleen. I think though that for me, the devil is in the detail of the standards, not necessarily in that high level as we sort of mentioned, you know, prior to coming on here, in the, you know, the actual, you know, 1.1. It's in what kind of is sitting underneath some of that. And I think to some extent these standards have become much more prescriptive in some areas and much less prescriptive in others. And it's been, you know, it's been interesting to read through in the areas where, you know, they've pulled back on the prescription, but put much more prescription into other areas. And I think that they look very similar in a lot of cases, but I do think it's going to come down to some of that detail that is sitting within those standards.
Absolutely. And obviously, yeah, we are focusing today on 1.1. So I'll give a quick read of the standard and just kind of get initial thoughts, and then we'll kind of go and dig into the detail a little bit more. So 1.1 is around engaging and well-structured training. There's a lot of interesting words in there. The training delivered is engaging and well-structured and enables learners to attain skills, knowledge consistent with the training products. The RTO demonstrates training is consistent with the requirements of the training products. The mode of delivery enables learners to attain skills and knowledge consistent with the training product. The training is structured and paced to support learners, providing sufficient time for instruction, practice, feedback, and assessment. Training facilitation techniques, activities, resources engage and motivate learners and support learner understanding. And where the training product requires work-based, work-integrated training, work placements, or other community-based learning, necessary skills and knowledge are able to be obtained in that environment. So to me, like the first time I read that, I was like, there's a lot of keywords in there that I can, like, that scream out to me, I'm going to be audited. This word in particular is going to be audited. So that was kind of like my initial, I was like, that's a big change. And obviously the change to training resources as well, like that really strong focus back on training, which we knew was coming through from the feedback that people had been giving for years. Like we're not registered assessment organizations, we're registered training organizations. Can we please focus on training? I was really, really happy to see that come back. But yeah, my first thing when I looked it up from like with my little audit lens, I was like, there's like 20 words in there that are going to get audited out of. Maree, what were your thoughts looking at it the first time around?
Yeah, Lauren, my copy of the standards, which I have sitting in front of me on the screen here, is just covered with highlights of exactly what you've said. Those words that, and some of them to me are jumping out as rather subjective. And I just, you know, particularly words like engage and motivate.
Yeah.
The facilitation technique, engage and motivate. And, you know, look, okay, if we go through it, you know, it's consistent with the requirements of the training package. Of course, you know, surely we're making sure that we cover everything in that training product. Okay. That's not new, you know, and there's nothing there that I've highlighted that looks, you know.
B was like, meh, you know, okay, cool. Yeah, totally expected to see that.
Yeah. The mode of delivery, I think, is something that and I think that is something, it is in our current standards, you know, it very clearly says our mode of delivery. But I think it's something for me that has been missing in a lot of the design of training, that the actual mode of training that is being used. And I think it's probably something we come back to in terms of discuss, but it's not new. So it's in our current standards, not necessarily being well done right now, but it is in the current standards. Structured and paced. Whoa. You know, that to me stands out like a great big red flag. You know, I look at a lot of training resources in particular, and, you know, they're based on elements, and then they're based on performance criteria, and then they're based on, you know, the knowledge evidence, and then they're based on, oh, we'll just stick this bit at the bottom because they're the, you know, the sort of the gaps of the knowledge evidence. Now, you know, I think that this is placing a lot more emphasis on, it's just my interpretation, because of course we don't have, you know, guidelines or anything at the moment, but you know, is that a structure, you know, or is that just following, you know, here it is and making sure we've got a sentence for every performance criteria sort of thing. But from a, you know, from a training background, you know, structure is probably a whole lot more than that. You know, the length of the sessions, what do I cover first? Do I integrate practical demonstration with, you know, with the knowledge, you know, so we're covering off on the stuff we do first and then followed by the stuff we do next and whatever, and having those, you know, that practice time in between or whatever it might be. So structure jumped out at me, to be honest. But the big one that did jump out was the training facilitation techniques, the activities and the resources engage and motivate learners. Whoa.
How do we do that?
Wow.
How do we audit that?
How do you show that for a start?
How do you evidence it? Yeah.
And yeah, and sort of thinking about all the different types of learners, you know, what might engage and motivate me as a learner might be very different to a, you know, 20-something-year-old, you know, I'm past my prime, you know, a 20-something-year-old, you know, person who hasn't been in the workplace for, you know, a considerable amount of time or whatever. So is there an expectation there on sort of having all these different modes that engage and motivate? Or is it sort of what comes next in, you know, got to talk about the structure of the standards, knowing your learners, you know, who are they, what engages and motivates them, you know, and therefore you have all these different strategies or different modes for I don't know, that's probably the big one that really, you know, sort of struck me as being a fairly subjective standard. And
Yeah.
how do you prove it? How do you prove that? Engaging and motivating, because you know what engages and motivates me might be very different to somebody different.
Is this going to require evidence of, you know, more feedback from learners about how motivating the training was, or about, you know, about how engaging the program was? Is this going to be something that RTOs are going to have to gather so that they can evidence that they actually are providing that engaging, motivating training? And, you know, that's so subjective anyway, as you say, because, you know, you can have one trainer who's just an extrovert and does a great job and entertains everyone, and maybe he isn't even a great trainer but entertains everyone. And you know, I don't know how we're going to measure it, evidence it. I mean, and it's subjective even if we're going to say, well, here is our textbook, or here is our PowerPoint slideshow, or here is our handouts, here's our online system. Again, that's subjective. How is the auditor, how are we going to make sure, what are the criteria for those things? Because what one auditor finds engaging, another might not. You know,
and well, it's interesting you should say about the entertaining trainer, Coleen, because I went to, you know, I'm always one of these people, I go to definitions, you know, what do we mean by that? So, you know, I looked up engaging, you know, what are we looking for in engaging? You know, it occupies or attracts somebody's attention or interest. Okay. They are able to participate or become involved in. And that could actually be a good lead in to what engaging might be, you know, that whole, you know, it's participatory. It doesn't mean to say necessarily that it has to be face-to-face, but there are, you know, but somehow they're actually becoming involved in the training. Establishing a meaningful or connection with, you know, so isn't that subjective? But the other definition was it's entertaining, it's fun, or interesting and pleasing in a way that holds your attention. It's like, wow, okay. You know, and I can imagine, you know, as you say, some very entertaining trainers in a face-to-face environment may well be able to make it, you know, entertaining, fun, interesting. But, you know, the reality is that, you know, a lot of our training is happening online. It's happening in blended type environments. It's happening, you know, even in the, you know, text-based, you know, resources. So, you know, it's a challenge. I think it's going to be a challenge for RTOs to be making those modes of delivery engaging.
Do you think that it was somewhat brought up though? I mean, because when I started looking at that one, I was like, okay, what's the motivation for bringing it online? And looking back through, you know, audits and performance assessments, I'm going, it's come from the place of RTOs purchasing off-the-shelf resources that are literally like the most generic images. As you said, it's element performance criteria, 2 lines, next performance criteria, 2 lines, no real substance. And I was speaking with someone about this yesterday, and they were like, we've got rangers doing this program, but the rangers they don't understand it because nothing's contextualized to them. It doesn't explain, you know, it doesn't talk about the animals in our area. It doesn't talk about the challenges in our area. It doesn't talk about the environment of our area. They were like, they can't actually put the text into context. And I was like, that's the motivation of the regulator behind this would be, my assumption is like, they don't want to see an RTO turning around and going, here's my one assessment tool and here's my one assessment resource. And we deliver this to people in the workplace. We deliver this to international students and we deliver this to job seekers. And we've got this one resource that we paid, you know, $99 for, and that meets all of our cohort's needs. Like, you know, how would you write a standard that's like, that's not okay, guys? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And, you know, well, I mean, you guys are working in more the audit space. I probably don't want to because I see so often things that look so messy to me that I see that too often. I see it all the time. And
but
Coleen, people are just buying stuff. They don't even care. They're just throwing it out there, and they're saying things like, oh, well, it's not about the resource, it's the trainer. But my response to that is you've got a business plan on a trainer who can move. It's got to be, your training system has to be good. Not just your assessment system, your training system. But go on.
But Coleen, I was going to say, as you know, you mentioned before that you develop, you know, training resources and materials. So, you know, what are some of the, you know, for me, what are some of the things that you would therefore consider that would make those resources, you know, engaging? And for me, Lauren mentioned one of them for me before, it's relevant, you know, so. Yeah. So it's, you know, it's meaningful. I think the word is real and meaningful. You know, they are, you know, that they use, you know, media clips of, you know, current events. You know, that they have little activities for students. I mean, nothing to prevent, you know, asking a student to go out and sit in a coffee shop and watch, you know, what's going, you know, having activities that are real, not activities that are simply, here's a quiz on what you covered in chapter 1.
Yeah, but I think practical examples as well, like we're writing horticulture materials at the moment for the Pilbara, right? So when we're writing examples, when we're creating the assessments in and around, you know, growing the media or setting the things, we're using examples of like, you know, plants that are local to the area. Right, as opposed to going, so the generic materials might have a rose bush. Well, there ain't a lot of rose bushes out in the Pilbara, right? So we're going to use like spinifex, and we're going to use more native grasses and things like that. You know, I think that, and I know Coleen, like I think that's a little like that's really why a lot of people come to you, is because they're like, I don't want generic. I want something
Mm.
specific and meaningful to my business and to, to my cohort and things like that. That's a big space that you play in, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, look, I have wonderful customers, and some are more innovative than others, and some are more structured and traditional than others. And I find it's much more exciting to work with that RTO that's open to creative ideas, and but a lot of the time they just want the same thing. I remember once having, and I don't do a lot of learning resources at the moment, but I remember once having someone complain that my learning resources weren't in the order of the PCs. Like, that there are a lot of RTOs are running their business on and I get it. I've owned businesses. You've got a budget, and these are the schedules, and we're just trying to fit everything into boxes so it runs smoothly. And we want, there to always be 3 assessment tasks, and we want there to always be a textbook that's in this order, and I find that more difficult. So sometimes I still find myself having to build something that I would go, why don't we do? But I'm just the assessment writer. I'm not writing the TAS. I'm not writing the. Yeah.
Do you feel that is, and it's something that perhaps I've perceived is that that's a fear. They want it a certain way because there is a fear of compliance,
Yes.
and we throw this word around,
it's often
compliance.
From the compliance manager.
Yeah.
Looking for
Because someone go, yeah, I want to make sure, here's element 1, PC.
I'm going to make this rule, and it's going to be across every unit,
absolutely,
every qualification, and this is how we do it. And you're like,
absolutely. Whereas, see, in a training resource, you might have something about, hazard identification in chapter 1, paragraph 6. You might have something else on, when you're in chapter 2, driving the coach or something in chapter whatever. But it doesn't follow something that is, a lockstep. And I think I've seen this progression from, sort of much more holistic training, meaningful training, to being very much, element by element, because there is this sort of almost like a fear. If they can tick a box and say, oh, this has got a heading and it's PC 2.3, tick, we've covered that, as opposed to, well, it's actually covered off in 4 or 5 chapters of that particular resource, or but you need to look for it.
And I've seen people wanting to, and you guys have seen this before, and I understand the compliance of how they came to this conclusion and why, but they want to map that resource, that learning resource. They want it all mapped. And so they want it nice and tidy, so it all maps into their lovely mapping document really nicely, so that anyone can find that PC and find that paragraph or page in the textbook. And, those things are what make it less engaging, frankly, because, the unit of competency, I mean, you sit there and you unpack these units of competency. Sometimes they're written in a way that makes sense. Sometimes they're a bit here and a bit there and a bit, you can't just go element by element, or, you can't, I mean, it's all integrated. It's just that this is the communication aspect and this is the something else aspect. They're holistic. And so trying to break those up into little assessments that we do, or how we schedule our classes, or how we prepare our online program, or, it does make it very restrictive. And I like, I was watching a video, Lauren, I think it was in your video, that you talked about that whole unpacking the whole job. What does the job actually look like? And build, obviously I build assessments mostly these days, and I'll build the assessment around that, but it's the learning too. The learning needs to be more, and it needs to be so much more than textbook. I mean, even when I owned RTOs, I used to think the textbook is just there as a resource, guys. You don't train from the textbook. The textbook is just there as one of the resources you use. We should be having, you know, all of these other things and activities and role plays, or, you know, if we're on the job, different ways that we're delivering training. But I all too often see that sometimes I see a schedule and we've got, I don't know, might be Crocos or Job Seeker Program or something, and we've got, you know, we're going to do this 1 day a week over 10 weeks. But of that, and it sounds like a lot, you go, oh, it sounds amount of training wise pretty good, until you break it down and you realize half of it's assessment to start with, and everything else in there is just theoretical, and you're just trying to squash this product into this time frame, and then this product into the same time frame, and this product, like each unit competency is somehow of equal value time-wise.
Mhm.
It's not.
And I think it's going to lead us into our next point beautifully. We're going to take a really quick break. Guys, if you aren't already following, please do like and subscribe. We're going to continue this series. If you are watching this series, you're going to come back and see us in about 3 days' time. Otherwise, we're going to come actually back in about 30 seconds. My name is Lauren Hollows, and thank you very much to Maree from Compliance Assist and Coleen from Raspberry Training. Guys, again, all of the links will be in the comment section below. Have a great day. This is Lauren Hollows for NOI Education Services.